Introducing speakers is always difficult. When I was a young officer, there was a very renowned dining-in night that took place in the mess at 2-4RAR up in Townsville, and it was in the sergeant's mess. It was a combined mess dinner, and there were about 150 officers and senior NCOs, warrant officers there, and the guest of honour was Bob Hawke, and the RSM, who was a man given more to action than contemplation, and he wasn't renowned for his public speaking, went out to meet Commonwealth One, the big white car, as it swept in, and Bob, with his wonderfully manicured silver hair, got out of the car, and the RSM said, Prime Minister, I'm the dining president for the evening, and we'll shortly be walking into the mess, and I'll be introducing you to those assembled. And Bob said, well, comrade, that'll be outstanding. Let's get on with it. And they came into the mess, and the RSM, having told Bob how this was going to happen, called everyone to attention. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Bob Menzies. There was a deathly silence in the room. Most of us reflected on how unfortunate it would have been if it should have been on the other foot, and it had been Bob Menzies that he had been introducing as Bob Hawke. Bob thought it was very funny, but Bob Menzies would not have. VCDF, David Johnson, Belinda, General John Fruin, Janelle, my great friend Chris Deeble, Ambassador, General Officers, Flag Officers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for the kind invitation to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. Jenny and I are very pleased to be here, and I'm honoured to have been asked to speak this evening at what I think is a very important event. I was advised as a young officer that when speaking at dinner you should be advised by the 3 Bs. You should be upstanding, you should be brief, and you should be seated. So I will try and follow that exhortation this evening. My subject, as has been said, is Australia in an uncertain, and I've added a fractious world. I've added that because since 7 or 8 weeks ago, when Bill and I discussed what sort of topic I would cover this evening, of course, the conflict in Gaza has occurred since then. So the issue of the fractures that are occurring in the world, continue on a kind of monthly, or at least, not a daily basis, but every few months there's another fracas going on somewhere in the world. And so it's a very suitable topic for us to be thinking about and reflecting upon. And I do worry about the way in which Australia approaches the world. We have some expertise, but every now and again we drop the ball. I was fairly critical a year or two ago in the aftermath of our attempts to have China investigated for the COVID outbreak. I was disappointed with the way in which our government managed the issue of letting down the French with a submarine deal. I think these things were badly managed, and we have a tendency from time to time to be shrill. I'm always reminded of the words of Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt said that in life, as you walk through life, you should speak softly and carry a big stick. And from time to time, we speak loudly and carry not much more than a twig. We need to be very careful to get these things into balance and make sure that we take a mature approach as we face the world, and it's particularly acute at this time. Can I compliment the work of the United Services Institute? I think that the creation of awareness, the promotion of awareness of national security and defence, which is the purpose of the United Services Institute, is enormously important always, but it's particularly important, of course, at this time. It's unfortunate that the defence and national security debate in this country is confined largely to a cognoscenti who dabble in the nuances and the intricacies of the matter, but it's not widely and sensibly discussed in the community. And I think that anything that the USI can do in order to generate that sort of discussion and awareness is very worthwhile. Let me begin by saying that it is my view that Australia is a wonderful country. We have a great country. We are blessed with resources which we either dig out of the ground or grow material from or harvest out of our adjacent seas. We have a human resource which is fantastic. Healthy population, a population which is well educated, and a population, notwithstanding current issues about pressures, cost of living and so forth, a population that is prosperous and wealthy. I know there are exceptions to that, but those descriptions of our society hold. We are, astonishingly, after events like robo-debt, we are extraordinarily well governed in Australia. And as I look around the room, I see many of you who have spent time living overseas in some countries where you would know that governance is appalling. And we are actually governed well in Australia. I'm very proud of these things. We're blessed also with the remoteness of geography. And we can argue about whether that still holds with modern technology and missiles and the compression of distance and the effect of globalisation. But the fact is, we're still a long way from anywhere, and we're separated from the rest of the world by very large tracts of water. So we are blessed. But let me come back to the subject at hand, which is the issue of Australia in an uncertain and a fractious world. And I want to talk about 5 challenges that I see that are worth focusing on. There are many more, but these 5, I think, are the key points, are the key challenges that we face going forward. They are great power rivalry, the threat to the rules-based world order, the assault on democracy, the vulnerabilities of modernity, and finally, the thing that underpins or answers all 4 of those issues, the cost of addressing those challenges. So let me take them in order. Great power rivalry. We all know, we understand, I think, quite clearly now what is going on in the world, that we do have a return of great power rivalry. It was something that I would have thought for most of my working life was not going to happen. That was pretty foolish. It's back, and it's back in spades. The relationship between the United States and China is going to determine the kind of world that we live in for the rest of our lives and the world that our children live in for their lives. That relationship is going to have to be exquisitely managed because China has emerged as a great power. And like all great powers, it's trying to shape the world in such a way that it's conducive to its needs and its wants. Nothing wrong with that. All great powers do it. That's what the United States has been doing for the last 130 years. That's what Great Britain did for several hundred years before it. And so on, you go back in history. But China has arrived, and the way in which China is going to be accommodated, one way or the other, is going to be a challenge. It took some time, in my view, to get the attention of both Washington and the European capitals about this. I was the ambassador in Brussels. I travelled up and down the Atlantic seaboard about 8 or 9 years ago and could not get a spark in the capitals of Europe to say, to respond to my proposition that if they didn't care about China, China was going to come to them anyway. Anyway, you know, it's now happened. The United States itself took some time, but it's very clear to me now from my recent engagement with all sorts of folks in the United States that the US is absolutely focused on China. It sees it as a peer competitor, and it is taking up the challenge to engage with China in a competitive sense wherever it is evident that it's required. The US is an ally. I am an Americophile, personally. Jenny and I lived there. It's a wonderful country. I will remain an Americophile. But it is an ally which now needs support. I think it realises that. The question is whether it can assemble a collection of like-minded countries, fellow travellers, that can provide that support and ensure that democracy prevails and freedom prevails. Because I do think, whether they like it or not, the United States government and the United States as a nation carries a leadership role globally in this regard. What have we done about all of this? Well, of course, it's very evident that a direct outcome, if you like, of great power rivalry was the sudden emergence, like a submarine surfacing, I mix my metaphors here, of AUKUS. You know? AUKUS, like a rabbit out of a hat or something. But anyway, it appeared to augment what was 2 years ago the 70th anniversary of ANZUS. Wonderful alliance that stood us in such good stead. We now have AUKUS. It's rather unusual. It's still settling down. My dear and recently late friend Alan Gingell said that AUKUS was something about which he was not persuaded, but he was persuadable. It's probably where I sit at this point. More persuaded now than perhaps I was, but nevertheless, I do subscribe to the theme that it's such an important brick now in our security structure that it cannot fail. It must not, and we're going to have to put everything behind it. But whether it's a done deal or not is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. Again, I look around the room and I see many of you who have lived in Washington, many of you who understand how the Hill works to the extent that that can be understood. But, you all know that the senator from Kentucky, may derail this thing at any time. And that will be an internal matter for the United States body politic. So we're right now in a situation of great power rivalry, which is, euphemistically described as competition, and we talk about it deteriorating potentially into crisis and maybe conflict. Now, I am not one of those, by the way, that subscribes to the inevitability of conflict. The nonsense that's been spoken from time to time about the drums of war and so on is unhelpful, and it's also inaccurate. It is entirely within the wit of man to avoid these sort of conflicts, but it would be imprudent and it would be foolish not to be preparing for the worst. The second point I wanted to make was the threat to the rules-based world order. You all know that in July 1944, in the little town of Bretton Woods, just outside of New York, a group of men of a certain age got together and set up the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that went on to see, as a subsequent action, the creation of the World Bank and the IMF, and then the UN popped out, and then a whole bunch of international rules and arrangements were agreed upon in the way in which nations would engage with one another. And that was particularly true in the financial area, but it also spilled out into more strategic issues of the rules of the road. We now know that those rules are seen by many in the world, particularly by the dictatorships or the autocracies, and particularly by some countries that are perhaps less well off than others, the impoverished sort of parts of the world, in Africa, South America, some parts of Asia. Those folk now see the Bretton Woods Agreement as being one that was set up by a bunch of white guys for white guys, and that it doesn't have application or utility as it once did. And so those rules are trying to be rewritten. Now that's well and good, but I've got to say that the rules, such as they are, have been enormously beneficial for Australian prosperity and security over the last 70 or 80 years. And so we need to be very careful when discussions take place about the change to those rules, and those discussions are taking place, the rules are under threat. We need to make sure that our interests can still be supported by those rules into the future. The third thing I wanted to talk about was the assault on democracy. This comes from two sources. It comes from external and it comes internally. I always imagined that democracies were sort of like air. It just existed, it just happened. There was no other option than to live in a democracy. But it's very clear to me now that there are very important forces in the world that think that's not the case. When I look externally, and you look at that, Scott Morrison used to talk with a rhetorical flourish about the arc of autocracy, running from, well, sort of back on here, but from your left-hand side, from Iran right up through Russia, North Asia, into China and down into North Korea. Those folk look at democracy and they see weakness. They say, we have brought millions of folks out of poverty, and here you are faffing about in your democratic mores, ill-disciplined, no one's pulling in the same direction, and look at what we're doing. We've got the game scum. So there is pressure from without. But more worryingly for me, and certainly in my last job in government in ASIO, is the pressure from within. And we do have in Western democracies large sections of the community which are disaffected, disenfranchised, either disempowered and certainly disconnected, and they see themselves as marginalised. And nowhere was that manifest more clearly than February 2 years ago on Capitol Hill in the United States, with the attack on Capitol Hill by that bunch of dissenters. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime, but there it is. And in our own country, we have some similar divisions, and we need to be very, very careful about democracy going forward from both the external and from the internal kind of pressures. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about was the vulnerability of modernity, and this is a bit more prosaic. This is the issue of technology which has delivered mankind the most marvellous advantages and progress, but at the one time having exposed terrific vulnerabilities for our society. Here we are on the cusp of coming to grips, I think, with artificial intelligence. There's a bit to go yet. Machine learning, a whole bunch of sort of modern concepts. I know from my grandkids that social media is, such an impactful thing on the society. I know from my time in ASIO the challenges we had with cyber security. And the fact is, with cyber, look, if you're in the spying game, cyber is fantastic. It's cheap, it's instantaneous. You get gratification immediately from the tape. It's all of those things. It's a very vulnerable medium. Now, if you aggregate all of this stuff, it leads to a phenomenon which I was introduced to by my great friend Jim Comey, who was the head of the FBI. He was the director of the FBI, famously sacked by Donald Trump. Wonderful man, Jim, but he used to talk about the concept or the issue of accelerated anxiety that fell out of this technology issue. Accelerated anxiety. And basically his thesis was that we as a species are now exposed to information about everything that's going on everywhere in the world every day. And Jenny thinks I'm a sad little man. I wake up in the morning and I whip out my device and I have a look at what's happening in the world. Sometimes I do that before I've got out of bed. Sometimes I do it not long after I get out of bed, but there's rarely a day goes by I don't have a look at my device to see what's happening in the world. And I see an earthquake in Turkey, or a flood in China, or a drought in North Africa, or I see the Gaza Strip incident going on. Now, that causes me to be anxious. I worry about these things, and yet there is damn all I can do about them, and they don't actually impact me directly. But I worry about them. And so it's taking up bandwidth that maybe I, and perhaps you, should be spending on things that you can affect, things that you can change, things that are of a first order priority in our minds. So I think this issue of accelerated anxiety is an interesting one to keep in mind. And it does impact our security. And so, having given you those four, I mentioned at the start I would come back to number 5, or I'd go on to number 5, which is how to pay for the first 4. And that's kind of tricky. I had a discussion only a couple of weeks ago with the Federal Treasurer. And, he's a man with a problem. And unfortunately that means we all have a problem. He doesn't have enough money to cover the bills. Well, he can cover the bills, we're solvent, but he hasn't got enough money to cover all of the bids that are coming in. And in particular, of course, the one that concerns government now is the bid that's coming in from the national security sector, and particularly from defence. And so the DSR, I go back to that, which is a wonderful document, and David and I were talking about this earlier tonight. I agree absolutely with the judgments made in the DSR. I think it's a terrific document. I think the jury's still out about how it's going to be paid for. What I can tell you is that the 2.1% or whatever it is that we're spending this year and next year is not going to cover the cost of nuclear-propelled submarines, and it won't cover the cost, in my view, of the missile technology that we're taking on, or some of the more novel technologies. It's not going to cover the cost of the revamped surface fleet. We are going to need more money put into defence in the forwards. Now, that's easier said than done. I've been around these boys a few times. And so what do we do about this? It is my view, and it has been for some time now, that the Australian government needs to strike an agreement with the Australian people. They need to receive licence from the Australian people to increase defence and national security expenditure. Now, that is not going to be easy, because the corollary of that is a reduction in the standard of living. It's very clear to me. And I just can't imagine where you start. But a start indeed has to be made. There needs to be a contract between the Australian government and the Australian people about what part of national treasure we actually direct towards defence and national security, and we are not at the right balance at present. So, let me conclude by saying that in this uncertain world, in this fractious world, there are, in my view, those 5 great challenges that we face. The challenge of great power rivalry, the threat to the rules-based world order, the direct threat to democracy itself, and the threat that comes through the vulnerability of modernity. And then finally, the cost. These things are something which we must pay great attention to. I applaud again the United Services Institute for the role that it plays. And again, as I look around the room, I see so many of you who are still serving in either uniform or in government more broadly. Those of you in industry that are involved in the defence industry sector. We have, we're a bit like the boy with a wheelbarrow. We've got the job in front of us, and there is much work to be done. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to finish there.
Duncan Lewis AODSCCSC is the board chair of Thales Australia, bringing with him a wealth of knowledge and experience acquired over his 47-year career with the Australian government, both in and out of uniform. Duncan retired as Director General of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation in 2019 following a career that included Commander of Australia's Special Air Service Regiment, National Security Advisor to the Federal Government, Secretary of the Department of Defence and Ambassador to Belgium, the European Union, Luxembourg and NATO. He joined the Australian Army after schooling in Western Australia, and graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1975. His 33-year career in the military culminated in his appointment as Major General, Special Operations Commander Australia. In 2005, Duncan joined the National Security Division within the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and was appointed as Australia's inaugural National Security Advisor in 2008. In 2011, building on almost 4 decades of experience in defence and national security communities, Duncan was appointed Secretary of the Department of Defence. Late in 2012, Duncan was appointed Ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, the European Union and NATO. On the 15th of September, 2014, Duncan was appointed Director General of Security and head of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. Duncan was awarded Officer of the Order of Australia in 2005 for his service as the inaugural Special Operations Commander Australia.